By 1980, the once mighty American muscle car had become a shadow of its former self. High insurance premiums, fuel economy demands, and tightening emissions regulations strangled performance. Manufacturers still dress cars in spoilers, stripes, and scoops, but the firepower was mostly for show. The term super muscle was clinging to life, but these cars helped bury it for good. They looked like legends, but their performance told another story, one of disappointment and retreat. Here are 10 American super muscle cars from 1980 that did more to make the muscle car disappear than to keep it alive.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 10, the 1981 Pontiac Firebird Formula, focusing on its context, design, performance, market position, and why it faded into obscurity. In the early 1980s, Pontiac's Firebird lineup was one of the iconic muscle car families, aiming to capture buyers who wanted sporty performance mixed with a dash of style and street credibility. Among its variants, the 1981 Pontiac Firebird Formula stood out as a middle ground offering, positioned between the basic Firebird Coupe and the flashier Trans Am. However, despite its respectable performance and V8 power, the Formula model struggled to carve out its own identity and ultimately faded as the Trans Am dominated attention. Pontiac Firebird lineup. The Firebird, introduced in 1967, was Pontiac's answer to the Ford Mustang and Chevrolet Camaro. Over time, the Firebird lineup grew to include multiple trims, from the base Firebird Coupe, the mid-level Formula, and the top-tier Trans Am. The Formula's role. Introduced as a stripped-down alternative to the Trans Am, the Formula was meant for buyers seeking V8 muscle but without the aggressive styling and premium options that marked the Trans Am. It was supposed to be the sensible muscle car, performance-oriented yet somewhat understated. The early 80s were tough years for muscle cars in general. Rising insurance costs, stricter emissions regulations, and fuel economy concerns meant horsepower was dropping and performance cars had to compromise. The 1981 Firebird was in its second year of the third-generation model, which began in 1980. This generation featured a more aerodynamic, lighter, and modern design compared to its boxy predecessors. The Trans Am was already an established legend by this time, boosted further by pop culture, especially after the 1977 film Smokey and the Bandit. Visuals. The Formula was visually much more subdued than the Trans Am. It lacked the signature hood scoops, decals, and aggressive graphics that gave the Trans Am its iconic look. Exterior features. The Formula typically had a flat hood, no shaker scoop, simpler wheels, and minimal badging. This restrained appearance made the Formula less flashy, but also less immediately recognizable and less appealing to enthusiasts who wanted to make a statement. V8 power. The 1981 Formula came standard with a 5.0-liter, 305 cubic inch V8 engine. It produced around 145 to 155 horsepower, depending on configuration. A respectable output for the time, but down from the muscle car heyday of the late 60s and early 70s. Transmission options included a 4-speed manual or 3-speed automatic. Chassis and suspension. The Formula shared the same suspension and chassis as the Trans Am, meaning it had good handling for the era, with a focus on sporty driving dynamics. Performance. The Formula was quick enough for everyday driving and had decent V8 muscle, but it lacked the high-performance enhancements or tuning that made the Trans Am stand out. The Formula struggled to differentiate itself clearly. Enthusiasts gravitated toward the Trans Am for its flash and higher performance, while more budget-conscious buyers often chose the base Firebird or other more affordable options. Competition. The Formula was competing in a muscle car market shrinking rapidly due to regulatory and economic pressures. Cars like the Chevrolet Camaro Z28 and Ford Mustang were also adapting. The Firebird Formula's lack of unique style and slightly lower performance meant it was overlooked both by critics and the buying public. Overshadowed by the Trans Am? The Trans Am was Pontiac's halo car, heavily marketed, iconic, and loaded with visual cues that made it a pop culture icon. It had aggressive styling, special editions, and stronger engines. Lack of identity. The formula was essentially a no-frills Trans Am without the flair. This left it in a marketing gray zone where it neither appealed strongly to muscle car enthusiasts nor to casual buyers looking for a stylish sporty car. Limited production and awareness. Pontiac didn't heavily promote the formula, leading to limited awareness. As a result, many people didn't even know it existed. By the mid-1980s, Pontiac started to phase out the formula as focus shifted toward more specialized models or newer performance line. Number 9, the 1983 Dodge Shelby Charger, exploring its origins, design, performance, reception, and legacy. By the early 1980s, the American muscle car was on life support. Emissions regulations, insurance hikes, and oil crises had nearly killed the high horsepower V8s of the 1960s and early 70s. Into this bleak performance landscape stepped a bold, unexpected experiment. The 1983 Dodge Shelby Charger. It wasn't a traditional muscle car by any stretch. Instead, it was a compact, lightweight, front-wheel drive hatchback, and yet it carried the legendary name of Carroll Shelby, the man behind the Cobra and GT350. The result was controversial, innovative, and ultimately short-lived. By 1983, Chrysler Corporation was still recovering from its financial near collapse in the late 70s. Dodge was shifting away from rear-wheel drive muscle cars like the Charger and Challenger and towards smaller, fuel-efficient vehicles like the Omni and Charger 2.2. The automotive industry needed a new kind of performance car, one that could be fun, efficient, and affordable. Enter Carroll Shelby, who teamed up with Dodge and Chrysler's performance-minded president, Lee Iacocca, to inject life into the Charger platform. The base vehicle was the front-wheel drive Dodge Charger 2.2, itself a rebadged and sportier version of the Omni 24, a small hatchback based on Chrysler's L-body platform. Shelby didn't build the car himself in 1983. Instead, Dodge applied Shelby's name and tuning philosophy under license. Shelby would get more directly involved in later years, particularly with the GLH series. The goal was to revive American performance, not with brute force V8s, but with clever engineering, lightweight construction, and aggressive styling, all wrapped in a fuel-efficient package. Visually, the 1983 Dodge Shelby Charger stood out in an era of bland boxes. Two-tone paint, often silver and blue or black and red, aggressive front fascia with an integrated air dam, louvers on the rear quarter windows, unique Shelby badging and striping. It looked fast, even standing still, especially compared to the conservative econoboxes populating American roads at the time. While it was just a hatchback, the styling cues borrowed from traditional muscle cars gave it street presence. The Shelby Charger was powered by a 2.2-liter inline-4 engine. No turbo, yet, just naturally aspirated. Outputs, 107 horsepower and 118 pound-feet of torque. Transmission, 5-speed manual standard, which was key to extracting performance. Weighing just around 2,300 pounds, it had a respectable power-to-weight ratio, giving it peppy acceleration and nimble handling. Shelby-tuned suspension upgrades included quicker steering rack, lower ride height, stiffer springs and shocks, larger sway bars. Brakes and tires were modest by modern standards but sufficient for the car's weight and performance goals. Affordable performance. With a low price and decent speed, it was accessible to younger buyers. Fun factor. Reviewers noted its tossable nature, quick reflexes, and spirited driving experience. Distinct style. Visually, it punched above its weight class. It wasn't rear-wheel drive, a cardinal sin for traditional muscle car fans. The 4-cylinder engine lacked the rumble and brute force of the classic V8 Chargers. Some called it a pretender that tarnished the Shelby name. Market confusion. Was it a sports car? A muscle car? A commuter? It fell into a niche that wasn't fully defined at the time. The 1983 model was only the beginning. In later years, Dodge and Shelby would introduce turbocharged versions, like the 1985 Shelby Charger Turbo, and eventually the Shelby GLHS, which genuinely delivered high performance in a compact form. However, by the late 1980s, the Shelby Charger and its variants were phased out in favor of newer platforms like the Dodge Shadow and Daytona. The market was also changing. Japanese hot hatches, Civic Si, CRX, Corolla FX16, began to dominate the affordable performance segment. The 1983 Dodge Shelby Charger marked a major turning point in American performance. It helped prove that fun to drive didn't require V8s or rear-wheel drive. It laid the groundwork for future Shelby-Dodge collaborations. It contributed to the hot hatch movement in the US, albeit with an American twist. Number 8, the 1985 Chevrolet Citation X11, exploring its background, engineering, reception, and legacy. By the mid-1980s, American automakers were desperately trying to reinvent performance. The era of big block muscle was long gone, and buyers now favored lighter front-wheel drive cars that sipped fuel. In this context, GM made a bold, and some might say doomed attempt to build a domestic, hot hatch with the Chevrolet Citation X11. Based on the controversial and problem-prone Citation, the X11 was meant to be the performance variant that could compete with European and Japanese compacts. It had sharper handling, a V6 engine, and sporty aspirations, but it was tied to a platform so flawed that it never stood a chance. In 1980, GM launched its ambitious X-Car platform, front-wheel drive compacts meant to modernize the aging lineup and compete with imports like the Honda Accord and Volkswagen Rabbit. The Chevrolet Citation was the flagship of this effort. Upon its debut, it won Motor Trend's Car of the Year and generated massive initial sales. But the honeymoon ended quickly. The Citation, and other X-cars like the Pontiac Phoenix and Buick Skylark, suffered from horrendous quality control, recalls, brake failures, and suspension problems. It soon became a symbol of GM's engineering shortcuts. To salvage the platform's reputation and appeal to young drivers, GM introduced the Citation X11 in 1981 as a sporty variant. By 1985, it had evolved into a reasonably potent compact coupe with serious ambitions. The 1985 Citation X11 distinguished itself visually from the base model. Blacked-out trim and sporty striping. Future hood scoop, cosmetic in earlier years, actually opened in 1985. Rear spoiler. University, unique alloy wheels. X11 badging that suggested something more sinister under the hood. While the design was still conservative overall, these touches gave it a slightly aggressive, tuner-inspired look that set it apart from its frumpy siblings. The 1985 X11 was powered by a 2.8-liter V6 from GM's 60-degree engine family. Output, 135 horsepower and 165 pound-foot of torque. Transmission, 4-speed manual, standard, or optional 3-speed automatic. Weighing around 2,800 pounds, the X11 offered surprisingly good straight-line performance for a domestic compact. 0 to 60 miles an hour in around 8.5 seconds, quarter mile in roughly 16.5 seconds. It was significantly quicker than a standard Citation, and even compared favorably to some of its import rivals like the VW Golf GTI and Ford Escort GT, at least on paper. The X11 wasn't just about power. GM actually invested effort into improving handling. Stiffer suspension tuning, larger stabilizer bars, special rear trailing arm suspension setup, faster steering ratio. On paper, these changes made the X11 a decently nimble front driver with reduced understeer and more confidence in corners. The X11 was praised by some automotive journalists for its spirited driving and acceleration, especially compared to other American compacts of the era. But it was also weighed down by the Citation's abysmal reputation. Multiple recalls had soured the public's opinion. Build quality remained questionable even in 1985. Many consumers simply didn't trust the car anymore. As a result, sales were modest, and the X11 never achieved the cultural traction of other performance compacts like the GTI or even the Shelby Charger. 1985 was the final full year for the Chevrolet Citation and the X-Car platform. GM quietly phased it out in 1986 in favor of newer designs like the Corsica and Beretta. The X11 disappeared along with it, an ambitious, ultimately failed experiment in domestic performance hatchbacks. The Citation X11 is a footnote in muscle car and hot hatch history, but it's an instructive one. It represents GM's struggle to adapt in the 1980s. trying to blend sportiness, efficiency, and modern engineering, but without the build quality and long-term durability needed to compete. It also highlights how a bad platform can doom a good idea. Even with V6 power and sporty tuning, the X11 couldn't outrun the sins of the Citation. Today, surviving X11s are rare and obscure, appreciated mostly by niche collectors or fans of 1980s automotive oddities. Number 7, the 1983 AMC Spirit GT, a unique but largely forgotten chapter in American muscle history. In the early 1980s, the American muscle car was undergoing a profound identity crisis. The golden era of the 1960s was long gone, buried beneath emissions regulations, fuel crises, and a growing shift toward efficiency and practicality. For American Motors Corporation, AMC, already on life support, the window for performance was nearly shut. And yet, in one of its final efforts to keep the dream alive, AMC offered the 1983 Spirit GT, a compact coupe with optional V8 power and muscle car intentions. This lecture explores how the 1983 AMC Spirit GT served as the brand's last gasp at performance, why it failed to gain traction, and what it reveals about AMC's declining role in the American automotive landscape. By 1983, AMC was a struggling independent automaker, having survived the 70s through sheer resourcefulness and a few odd successes like the AMC Gremlin, Pacer, and Eagle. Financial resources were limited, and product development lagged far behind the big three. AMC had entered a partnership with Renault, which was increasingly taking control of the company, steering it away from traditional American performance and toward more European-style compacts. Still, AMC hadn't completely given up on the American market's lingering love of performance cars, and the Spirit GT was one of its last attempts to capitalize on that niche. The AMC Spirit was introduced in 1979 as a replacement for the Gremlin. It came in a two-door sedan or a three-door liftback, fastback-style body. The GT version was the sportiest trim, available in limited numbers, and featuring cosmetic and mechanical upgrades. The Spirit itself was based on AMC's Hornet/Gremlin platform, which dated back to 1970, making it deeply outdated by 1983 standards. However, for buyers who wanted American-style muscle in a small package, the Spirit GT offered something unusual: rear-wheel drive, a V8 engine option, and a manual transmission. The Spirit GT's styling was boxy and dated, even for 1983. While other manufacturers were transitioning to sleeker, more aerodynamic designs, the Spirit GT retained an angular, stubby profile, square headlights and grille, fat rear hatch, and upright stance. Cosmetic GT features included blackout trim, rally-style wheels, bold side stripes and decals, rear spoiler and fog lamps on some models. Although it had a whiff of performance in its looks, it lacked the sleekness or drama of even the underpowered muscle-style cars of the early 80s, like the Firebird or Mustang. The Spirit GT was notable for offering the AMC 304 cubic inch V8 5.0 liter, producing around 125 to 150 horsepower, depending on tune and emissions equipment. While unimpressive by muscle car standards, the 304 still offered solid torque and a familiar V8 rumble. By 1983, the Spirit GT was wildly out of step with market trends. The platform felt ancient, the brand lacked visibility, competition from Ford, GM, and Japanese automakers offered better styling, engineering, and reliability. Muscle car enthusiasts weren't interested in a boxy AMC with limited aftermarket support. Meanwhile, average buyers found the Spirit unrefined, underwhelming, and tied to a brand that many assumed was already dead. As a result, sales were dismal, and the Spirit GT vanished with little fanfare after 1983. The 1983 AMC Spirit GT was one of the last American compacts to offer V8 rear-wheel drive performance in a true economy car package. In hindsight, the Spirit GT represents a kind of orphaned muscle car, a relic of a dying breed from a dying company. Enthusiasts today appreciate it more as a curiosity than a performance icon. It rarely appears in classic car shows, and surviving examples are scarce. Still, it holds value as an example of AMC's stubborn independence and willingness to try something different, even if the execution was too little, too late. The 1983 AMC Spirit GT was a noble but ultimately futile attempt to keep muscle car DNA alive in a world that had moved on. Dated styling, limited performance, and the fading strength of AMC's brand sealed its fate. Number 6. The 1982 Cadillac Civil Elegante Diesel, a luxury car that tried to combine American opulence with European style and failed spectacularly due to its ill-fated diesel engine. In the early 1980s, Cadillac was attempting to reinvent itself. The brand had long been a symbol of American luxury, big, plush, and powerful, but times were changing. European competitors like Mercedes-Benz and BMW were capturing the attention of affluent buyers with smaller, more refined sedans. In response, Cadillac introduced the Seville, and by 1982, the Elegante diesel trim tried to embody American comfort with European sophistication and fuel efficiency. But Cadillac's attempt to move with the times came with a fatal flaw: the Oldsmobile-sourced diesel V8. This power plant would become infamous for its poor reliability, gutless performance, and catastrophic reputation, dragging down the entire car with it. In the 1970s, Cadillac began to feel the heat from foreign automakers who offered tighter build quality, better driving dynamics, and more restrained design. GM's solution was the second-generation Seville, introduced in 1980. It featured a Mimar-class-like bustleback rear end, mimicking classic Rolls-Royce styling, sharper lines, shorter overhangs, and trimmer proportions, a Mimar-class-like front-wheel drive layout based on the GM K-body platform. Cadillac positioned the Seville as a sophisticated alternative to the German imports, but under the skin, it was still riding on shared GM architecture, including a disastrous engine option. The Elegante was the most luxurious trim of the Seville line. Two-tone exterior paint and special striping, wire wheels or optional cast aluminum rims, tufted leather seats, rich carpeting, and wood grain trim. Engine: a full suite of features. Digital displays, automatic climate control, power everything. On the surface, the Seville Elegante diesel had all the elements of a premium luxury car. It looked the part, and inside it felt rich and stately, at least while parked. And here's where it all unraveled. The 1982 Seville Elegante diesel came standard with the Oldsmobile 5.7-liter LF9 diesel V8, which produced just 105 horsepower, about 205 pound-feet of torque. Originally introduced in 1978 during the oil crisis, this engine was GM's attempt to answer rising fuel economy concerns without investing in new technology. The diesel was based on a gasoline engine block that had been hastily converted to diesel specs, a recipe for disaster. The LF9 diesel became notorious for its many issues: head gasket failures and cracked cylinder heads, weak fuel injection systems, frequent starter and glow plug issues, lack of torque and glacial acceleration. Worse still, it was extremely hard to diagnose and repair, especially for mechanics unfamiliar with diesel systems, which, in early 1980s America, was most of them. Reliability was so poor that Cadillac's reputation plummeted, especially among luxury buyers who expected refinement and dependability. The Seville Elegante diesel was slow, noisy, and sluggish, 60 miles per hour in nearly 18 seconds, topped out at about 90 miles per hour. The diesel clatter and vibrations undermined the luxury experience. Although the ride was relatively smooth, thanks to Cadillac's cushy suspension, it couldn't hide the engine's lack of refinement and general sluggishness. In real-world terms, the car was frustrating to drive and embarrassing when compared to German competitors offering smoother, better-performing six-cylinder gas engines. Buyers were lured by the promise of better fuel economy, about 23-27 mpg highway, impressive for the time in a luxury sedan. But most were furious once the reliability problems began. Warranty claims surged, lawsuits were filed, and GM's diesel experiment began collapsing. The Seville's reputation, and Cadillac's, took long-term damage. Even among GM loyalists, the diesel was widely seen as one of the company's biggest engineering missteps of the decade. The 1982 Seville Elegante diesel stands as a symbol of overreach and underdevelopment. Cadillac tried to compete with European sedans by copying their size and styling, but it failed by equipping its flagship with a subpar powertrain. Today, the diesel Seville is a rare collector's item, but more for its novelty and infamy than its quality. Number 5. The 1985 Pontiac Parisian Broham, a full-size car that symbolized GM's struggle to reconcile its performance roots with a changing market, and ultimately became a forgettable footnote in Pontiac's history. By the mid-1980s, Pontiac, once GM's self-proclaimed performance brand, had lost its identity. Gone were the tire-smoking GEOs and Trans Ams of the 60s and 70s. In their place were rebadged sedans and cautious experiments. The 1985 Pontiac Parisian Broham epitomized this drift. A plush, V8-powered full-size car that wore a muscle badge, but had none of the muscle spirit. It was big, slow, outdated, and largely irrelevant. Today's lecture dives into the Parisian Broham's confusing origins, aging design, and the reasons it failed to leave a mark despite wearing a once glorious badge. The Parisian nameplate was originally used by GM of Canada for upscale full-size Pontiacs dating back to the late 1950s. In the United States, Pontiac relied on the Bonneville and Catalina to fill the full-size segment. However, by the early 80s, shifting market forces prompted GM to bring the Parisian to the U.S. market in 1983 as a quick stopgap. It was a rebranded Chevrolet Caprice with minor Pontiac styling cues. The goal? To appeal to traditional full-size buyers who still wanted V8-powered comfort cruisers, even as those cars were rapidly falling out of favor. The Broham trim meant luxury. The 1985 Parisian Broham was dressed up in chrome accents, wire wheel covers, padded vinyl roof, plush velour or optional leather interiors, opera lighting, and lots of fake wood grain. Inside, it was quiet and soft, clearly aimed at older buyers who missed the 1970s luxury barges. But it didn't look or feel like a Pontiac. In fact, many observers joked that it looked more like a Chevy wearing Pontiac badges, which was not far from the truth. The 1985 Parisian Broham came standard with a 5.0-liter 3.5 cubic inch V8, paired with a 4-speed automatic transmission, turbo-hydromatic 200 4R. Optional was the 5.7-liter 350 V8 diesel, another risky move given GM's disastrous diesel reputation, as seen with the Cadillac Civil. Power output was underwhelming. The 3.5 V8 made 150-165 horsepower, depending on emissions package. Acceleration was sluggish, 0-60 in around 12-13 seconds. Fuel economy was mediocre, and performance was far removed from Pontiac's "We Build Excitement" marketing slogan. The Parisian rode on GM's ancient B-body platform, shared with the Caprice, Buick LeSabre, and Oldsmobile Delta 88. Driving experience? Soft suspension that wallowed through corners. Vague, overboosted steering. Pontiac's performance image was in direct conflict with the Parisien's personality. The Broham trim in particular emphasized luxury over speed, aiming for the same older clientele being courted by Buick or Oldsmobile. But Pontiac's younger, performance-oriented buyers had no interest in such a car. Meanwhile, luxury buyers were migrating to more modern cars like the Acura Legend, Volvo 760, and Mercedes 190e, leaving the Parisian stuck in no man's land. The Parisian name lasted only until 1986 in the US, after which it was discontinued. GM decided to consolidate platforms and move forward with front-wheel drive full-size models like the Bonneville and LeSabre. The Broham became a relic, not rare enough to be collectible, not good enough to be respected. Today, the 1985 Parisian Broham is remembered by few, often mistaken for a Caprice, and rarely discussed even in Pontiac enthusiast circles. The Parisian Broham reveals the cracks in GM's strategy during the 1980s. Badge engineering over innovation, mixed messaging to customers, clinging to outdated platforms while competitors advanced. For Pontiac, the car symbolized a brand that had abandoned performance heritage in favor of comfortable mediocrity. It wouldn't be until the late 80s and early 90s, with models like the Bonneville SSE and Grand Prix GTP, that Pontiac would attempt to reclaim some excitement. Number 4, the 1982 Chevrolet S10 Durango, a small pickup that tried to bring style and sportiness to the compact truck market, but ultimately lacked the performance to make a lasting impact. The early 1980s were a period of experimentation for American automakers. Fuel economy concerns, tightening regulations, and shifting buyer preferences pushed companies to try new combinations of form and function. One of the more curious outcomes of this was the 1982 Chevrolet S10 Durango, a compact pickup truck that tried to channel the spirit of muscle cars into a small hauler. While it carried sporty decals, bucket seats, and a V6 engine, the S10 Durango proved that looks alone don't build a legacy. Today's lecture breaks down what the Durango was, what it tried to be, and why it ultimately became a footnote in the history of American performance trucks. The Chevy S10 debuted in 1982 as General Motors' first in-house designed compact pickup. Before this, GM relied on rebadged Isuzu trucks like the Chevrolet Love. The S10 was meant to compete with the Ford Ranger, Dodge D50, and Japanese imports like the Toyota Hilux and Nissan Hardbody. GM offered various trim levels and equipment packages to appeal to different markets, from tradesmen to suburbanites. One such attempt at injecting style and personality into the new S10 line was the Durango Appearance Package. The Durango trim was not a separate model, but rather a visual and comfort upgrade package available on the base S10. Special body graphics and side stripes, blacked-out trim elements and grille, Crompters, deluxe cloth bucket seats, rally wheels or styled steel wheels, optional sliding rear window and sport mirrors. Some versions came in bright colors to help them stand out, making it one of the few compact pickups in the early 80s to suggest sportiness. While it looked the part, there was no mechanical difference between the Durango and standard S10s, and that was part of the problem. The 1982 S10 came with a range of engines. Standard, 1.9-liter Isuzu-sourced 4-cylinder, 82 horsepower. Optional, 2.8-liter V6, 110 horsepower. A few rare units had a 2.0-liter inline-4 from GM Brazil. The Durango typically came equipped with the 2.8-liter 60-degree V6, which was smoother than the 4-cylinder but still underwhelming in performance. Paired with either a 4-speed manual or 3-speed automatic, the truck's acceleration was modest, especially with a full load or larger tires. The 2.8-liter V6 offered decent low-end torque, but lacked any real muscle car spirit, especially compared to what Ford would later bring with the SVT Lightning or GM's own later Cyclone. The Durango offered no enhancements to suspension or brakes. Steering was typical of compact trucks of the era, slow and vague. Ride quality was firm, especially with the short wheelbase versions. Cornering performance was typical for a body-on-frame pickup, uninspired and top-heavy. The Durango trim did little to move the needle in terms of sales or reputation. Buyers who wanted sporty performance didn't look to compact pickups, and those who needed utility saw little value in the added graphics and fluff. The automotive press gave it little attention, often seeing it as a marketing exercise rather than a serious attempt at innovation. As the decade progressed, true performance trucks would emerge. The GMC Cyclone in 1991, a turbocharged all-wheel drive beast. The Ford SVT Lightning in 1993. These made the Durango look like a poser by comparison. The Durango nameplate itself would later be reused and better remembered on the Dodge Durango SUV, starting in 1998. The 1982 S10 Durango has little collector value today. Most examples have been scrapped, modified, or faded into obscurity. For GM, the Durango was a stepping stone, a test case in styling, without substance, that helped shape how not to build a performance truck. However, it did plant seeds for future experimentation. It showed that there was consumer interest in sporty trucks, even if the execution was still lacking. The 1982 Chevrolet S10 Durango tried to wear the muscle car mask on a compact pickup body, but underneath the stripes and bright paint was a basic, underpowered truck. Number 3, the 1983 Buick Regal Sport Coupe Turbo, a pivotal but often forgotten prelude to one of the greatest American performance cars of the 1980s. Before the menacing all-black Grand National and the legendary GNX earned their place in muscle car history, there was a quieter, subtler Buick that laid the foundation. The 1983 Buick Regal Sport Coupe Turbo was an unassuming but critical step in Buick's transformation, from a builder of plush sedans to a surprising force in the turbocharged performance world. Though overshadowed by what came after, the 83 Sport Coupe deserves recognition as the car that proved the Turbo V6 had real muscle car potential, even if few noticed at the time. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, performance was dying. Emissions laws, fuel economy standards, and insurance rates had killed the traditional V8 muscle car. Buick, historically known for building quiet, comfortable cars for older buyers, was exploring turbocharging as a way to bring back power without violating new regulations. This began with the 1978 Regal Sport Coupe, which first introduced a turbocharged version of Buick's 3.8-liter V6. It was novel, but crude. Over the next few years, Buick refined the technology, and by 1983, the Regal Sport Coupe had become a genuinely quick and competitive personal coupe, even if most people weren't paying attention. From the outside, the Sport Coupe didn't look like a performance car. It shared its basic two-door G-body shell with the regular Regal and its cousins, the Oldsmobile Cutlass and Chevy Monte Carlo. Its styling was conservative, chrome trim, smooth lines, and relatively plain wheels. Optionally striping and Sport Coupe badging hinted at performance, but just barely. It lacked the aggressive bodywork of the later Grand National, making it easy to overlook at a glance. In many ways, it looked like a Buick built for your uncle, not a future street dominator. Under the hood, though, the 1983 Regal Sport Coupe was serious business. 3.8-liter, 231 CID, turbocharged V6, produced 175 horsepower and 275 pound-feet of torque. Used a 4-barrel carburetor, EFI would come later. Paired with a 3-speed TH 350 automatic transmission, it delivered impressive acceleration for the time. 0 to 60 miles per hour in about 8.5 seconds, quarter mile in the high 15-second range. That may not sound fast today, but in 1983, those were solid numbers, especially from a V6-powered Buick. Buick didn't just boost the engine and call it a day. The Sport Coupe had a firmer suspension setup with improved springs, shocks, and sway bars. Power brakes and power steering were standard. Turbo-specific instrumentation included a boost gauge and tachometer, rare for a Buick. However, the carbureted turbo system had its flaws. Turbo lag was noticeable. Drivability could be inconsistent. Tuning and reliability were more art than science. Buick had already begun experimenting with a darker image in 1982, when it introduced the first Grand National, essentially a cosmetic package based on the Sport Coupe. In 1983, no Grand National was built, making the Sport Coupe the only turbo Regal available that year. But in 1984, the Grand National returned with fuel injection, more horsepower, all-black styling, greater media attention. The Sport Coupe instantly became obsolete, even though its basic mechanicals were nearly identical. By 1987, the GNX would solidify Buick's performance credibility, and the Sport Coupe would be all but forgotten. The 1983 Sport Coupe sold in modest numbers. It wasn't a huge hit. Buick's image at the time didn't attract younger buyers, and those looking for muscle cars rarely looked to the brand. The conservative looks and the lack of marketing push didn't help either. But without the Sport Coupe, there would be no Grand National. It was the test bed for turbo V6 performance that Buick later perfected. Today, the 1983 Regal Sport Coupe is a rare sight, and few collectors seek them out. However, it remains important to GM's history. It proved that V6 engines could replace V8s for performance. It laid the groundwork for turbocharging in American cars. It marked the turning point for Buick's short-lived, glorious performance revival. Number 2, the 1987 Buick Somerset Regal GS, an obscure, transitional car that wore a sporty badge but failed to back it up with performance or identity. It's a forgotten footnote in Buick's complicated 1980s journey between performance aspirations and luxury retreat. The 1980s were a strange decade for Buick. Just as it was making headlines with the Grand National and GNX, it was also quietly building bland, badge-engineered sedans in hopes of attracting younger buyers. One of the strangest efforts was the 1987 Buick Somerset Regal GS, a car that promised performance with its Grand Sport badge, but delivered little more than styling cues and marketing fluff. Today's lecture examines how the Somerset Regal GS came to exist, why it flopped, and how it reflects Buick's confusion about what kind of cars it wanted to build and for whom. In the mid-1980s, Buick introduced the Somerset, a compact front-wheel drive coupe based on GM's N-body platform, shared with the Oldsmobile Calais and Pontiac Grand Am. Separately, the Buick Regal was a midsize coupe and sedan on the G-body platform, known for spawning the Grand National. By 1987, Buick began cross-branding and mixing naming conventions, trying to capitalize on performance associations like Regal and GS while pushing compact front-wheel drive models. The result? A marketing Frankenstein called the Buick Somerset Regal GS, sold in extremely limited numbers and barely remembered today. The Somerset Regal GS looked like it wanted to be sporty. Flush headlamps, option two-tone paint, subtle GS badging, custom alloy wheels and blacked-out trim, but it still carried the styling DNA of a compact econobox. Compared to the bold, menacing Grand National or the crisply tailored Riviera, this car looked anonymous and confused. Buick seemed unsure who the target audience was. Was this a sporty coupe for younger buyers? Or a luxury commuter with some visual flair? The name alone, Somerset Regal GS, was a contradiction. Three identities in one badge. Buick offered the Somerset GS with its well-known 3.8L 231 CD V6, the naturally aspirated version, not the turbocharged engine from the Grand National. Output was around 150 horsepower, about 200 pound-feet of torque. That wasn't bad for the time, especially in a compact coupe. However, performance was hampered by a heavy curb weight for its size, front-wheel drive dynamics with substantial torque steer, a mandatory 4-speed automatic that dulled acceleration. 16 miles per hour was in the 9 to 10 second range, which was mediocre at best for a car wearing the GS badge, a name once associated with tire-shredding Buick Stage 1s of the early 1970s. The GS version did receive some minor upgrades: slightly firmer suspension, quicker steering ratio, larger sway bars. But this didn't turn the Somerset into a performance car. At best, it was a competent commuter. The Somerset Regal GS was just one symptom of Buick's 1980s identity crisis. The brand was torn between luxury aspirations and performance revival. It launched too many half-baked models, trying to borrow muscle car heritage without committing to real performance. While the GNX was earning headlines, Buick was quietly diluting the GS badge on cars like the Somerset, undermining its credibility. The Somerset itself didn't survive long. It was dropped after 1987. Buick then shifted to the Skylark name for its compact FWD lineup. The Grand Sport GS badge meant something in the 1960s and early 70s. It adorned legendary models like the GSX and GS 455 Stage 1. By putting it on a lightweight, underpowered front-wheel drive compact, Buick damaged the brand equity of the GS name. It would take years before Buick used GS meaningfully again. With the Regal GS of the 2000s and 2010s, which featured turbocharged or V6 power and serious suspension upgrades, the 1987 Buick Somerset Regal GS is a textbook example of a car with no clear purpose and an identity crisis baked into its name. It wore a sporty badge, had a decent V6, and looked the part, but couldn't back up the image. Sandwiched between Buick's performance peak, the GNX, and its return to pure luxury, the Somerset Regal GS was doomed to be forgotten. Number 1, the 1981 Chevrolet Camaro Z28 LG4, a car that looked like a muscle machine, but sadly couldn't back up its appearance. A classic example of how early 80s performance often lagged behind the styling. By 1981, the American muscle car was in retreat, strangled by emissions regulations, rising fuel economy standards, and insurance surcharges. Cars that once symbolized speed and rebellion were now shadows of their former selves. Into this uncertain landscape rolled the 1981 Chevrolet Camaro Z28, wearing bold stripes, scoops, and spoilers. Yet under the hood, it carried the LG4 305 V8, a small block engine producing just 165 horsepower. Today's lecture explores how this Z28 tried to keep the muscle car flame alive, but ended up as a loud-looking reminder of the performance lost during the malaise era. The second-generation Camaro had launched in 1970 with real muscle car credentials, including powerful SS and Z28 models. But by the late 1970s, rising federal regulations had gutted performance. Compression ratios dropped, emissions equipment choked engines, weight crept up due to safety add-ons. GMM still tried to sell the image of performance, especially through the Z28 trim. But by 1981, the power under the hood no longer matched the aggressive styling. If you judged it by appearances alone, the 1981 Z28 looked fast, functional hood scoop that opened under throttle, wide wraparound body-colored front and rear spoilers, striping kits down the flanks and on the hood. Blacked-out trim and flared fenders gave it street cred. Inside, it featured a sporty dashboard, rally gauges, and optional sports seats. This car screams speed, at least until you drove it. The base engine for the 1981 Z28 was the LG4 5.0-liter, 305 cubic inch V8. Output 165 horsepower and around 240 pound-feet of torque. Carbureted with a 4-barrel Rochester quadrajet, mated to either a 3-speed automatic or optional 4-speed manual. A more powerful Lu 5 Crossfire 350 was technically available in 1982, but 1981 buyers had no 350 option. The 305 LG4 was it. 60 miles per hour, around 9 seconds. Quarter mile, mid-16-second range. For comparison, late 60s Z28s hit 60 miles per hour in under 7 seconds. The 1981 model was slower than some economy cars of the day. The Z28 did include performance suspension tuning, front and rear sway bars, stiffer springs and shocks, power front disc brakes, but the platform was aging. This was the final year of the second-generation Camaro. Handling was decent for a 1981 American car, but nowhere near the capability of what was coming, namely the 1982 Camaro and IROC Z models. 1981 brought one notable tech addition, the Computer Command Control (CCC) system. The 1981 Z28 sold reasonably well. The styling attracted buyers, even if the power didn't impress. Car magazines criticized its weak engine, often praising the looks but lamenting the performance. Enthusiasts began gravitating toward the new Mustang GT, revived in 1982, or waiting for the third-gen Camaro that debuted in 1982. Once the IROC Z arrived in 1985 with fuel injection, improved suspension, and genuine power, the 1981 Z28 quickly became an outdated curiosity. The 1981 Z28 remains a visual favorite among some collectors for its aggressive stance and retro graphics. However, the LG4-powered cars are not highly sought after due to their weak performance. Some enthusiasts swap in crate motors or later 350s to give the car the power it always deserved. As the final year of the second-generation Camaro, it holds some historical significance but not much market value unless pristine. The 1981 Chevrolet Camaro Z28 LG4 looked like a muscle car, sounded like a muscle car, and even had the right name. But under the hood, it was a compromised performer, a casualty of the regulatory clampdown on horsepower in the late 70s and early 80s. Its legacy is bittersweet. It kept the Camaro name alive, wore its stripes with pride, and closed out the second generation with one last flash of style. But in terms of performance, it was already living in the past, and history moved on quickly once the IROC Z showed up.